You think caring makes you human. Caring makes you predictable. Listen carefully. The moments you lose are not the moments you lack talent or intelligence. They are the moments you care too much about how you are perceived while the game is being decided. You lean forward emotionally when you should be leaning back strategically. You reveal tension when silence would have done the work for you. You chase clarity when ambiguity would have protected you. You felt it, didn't you? That tightening in your chest when someone questions you in public. The urge to explain yourself in a group chat. The impulse to correct a misinterpretation immediately. As if delay equals defeat. You tell yourself it's about honesty, about integrity, about standing your ground. No, it's about attachment. Not strength, it's exposure. Here is the brutal truth. The person who cares least controls the frame, not because they are colder, but because they are freer. They are not negotiating with their own nerves while everyone else is negotiating with them. Think about it. You have seen this person in meetings, in social circles, in relationships. They speak less. When challenged, they don't rush. When criticized, they don't flinch. When ignored, they don't chase. And something strange happens around them. People lean in. The room adjusts. Others fill the silence with explanations, jokes, defenses. Power moves quietly toward the one who does not need to be seen trying. Most people never notice this. They think power belongs to the loudest voice or the fastest response. They confuse reaction speed with dominance. They mistake emotional availability for authenticity. They bleed information and call it transparency. That is the trap. Caring feels virtuous because it is noisy. It creates movement. It feels like participation. Detachment feels empty by comparison. It feels like absence, like risk, like you might disappear if you don't assert yourself. But watch what happens when you stop trying to manage perception moment by moment. You gain time. And time is where control lives. When you care, you rush to close loops. You want misunderstandings resolved. You want tension dissolved. You want reassurance returned. You move too early. And in doing so, you give others leverage over your emotional pacing. They learn what rattles you. They learn where to press. They learn how to pull a response out of you on demand. Not because they are cruel, but because you taught them. You trained them. Every time you explained yourself when silence would have made them sit with uncertainty. Every time you defended a decision that did not need defending. Every time you rushed to prove you were misunderstood, instead of letting the misunderstanding expose the other person's assumptions. Here's the brutal part. The more you care about being understood, the more you invite misinterpretation as a weapon. Detachment is not numbness, it is selectivity. It is deciding that not every signal deserves a response. Not every challenge deserves engagement. Not every opinion deserves your emotional labor. Listen carefully. Detachment is not about pretending not to feel. It is about refusing to let feeling dictate timing. Timing is everything. A delayed response feels heavier than an immediate one. A calm pause after provocation forces the other person to fill the space with their own insecurity. A non-reaction turns an attempted offense into an awkward self-reveal. You've seen this too. Someone tries to undermine you in a meeting. A subtle jab, a sideways comment framed as concern. You feel the heat rise. Your mind starts assembling a rebuttal before the sentence is finished. And then you pause. You don't smile. You don't frown. You don't rush. You simply let the comment hang. Now watch what happens when the silence stretches just long enough. They clarify. They soften. They over-explain. They retreat. You said nothing, but the room shifted. That is detachment in action. Not indifference, precision. Most people cannot tolerate the discomfort of unclosed loops. They need resolution. the way others need oxygen. They explain because they fear being misunderstood. They react because they fear losing status in real time. You don't need to win the moment. You need to own the sequence. Think about social media, public criticism, group dynamics. Someone questions your intent in front of others. The instinct is to respond immediately, to correct the record, to defend your name. Be careful. The fastest reply often belongs to the most emotionally invested party. Observers don't analyze the content. They feel the energy. They notice who seems pressed, who seems calm. Detachment flips the signal. When you don't rush to respond, you communicate that the judgment does not threaten your position, that you are not scrambling to protect your image, that you are comfortable letting time do some of the work. And time always reveals more than words. Now watch what happens when you stop caring about being liked. Not hated, liked. There is a difference. Liking is transactional. It demands constant maintenance. You monitor reactions. You adjust tone. You soften edges. You trade honesty for harmony and call it maturity. But harmony built on self-erasure rots quickly. Detachment allows you to be clear without being cruel, firm without being loud, unavailable without being hostile. You set boundaries not by announcing them, but by what you no longer respond to. Messages that would have hooked you last year now sit unanswered. Jokes at your expense don't get the reaction they were fishing for. Subtle tests of your availability meet a neutral delay. People notice. They always do. Some will feel uneasy. They were used to pulling your attention on command. Others will respect you more, even if they never say it. A few will push harder, trying to break the new pattern. That is how you know it's working. Here is the mechanism most people miss. Detachment forces others to project. When you don't explain yourself, they fill in the blanks with their own assumptions. When you don't react, they interpret your silence through their own emotional lens. Their insecurities surface. Their intentions become visible. You didn't interrogate them. You let them reveal themselves. Think about relationships. The moment you stop chasing reassurance, the power dynamic shifts. The moment you stop over-explaining your absence, your presence becomes heavier. The moment you stop asking where you stand, the other person starts wondering where they do. Not because you manipulated them, because you removed emotional subsidy. You stopped paying for comfort with your nervous system. That is the detachment switch. Most people never flip it because they are addicted to feedback. They need the signal that they are seen, validated, approved. Silence feels like death to them. You felt it, didn't you? That urge to double text, to clarify tone, to add one more sentence, so you're not misunderstood, to smooth over friction before it hardens. That is not kindness. That is fear, wearing a polite mask. Detachment exposes this fear and asks you to sit with it instead of feeding it. Now watch what happens when you don't care about correcting every misread. Some misreads correct themselves, others expose the reader. If someone assumes the worst of you without evidence, your defense won't change their mind. It will only confirm that their opinion matters to you. Silence, on the other hand, denies them confirmation. Not X, it's I. Not passivity, it's restraint. Not weakness, it's leverage. You choose when to speak, not because you are frozen, but because you are deliberate. Your words arrive with weight because they are not automatic. That is why detachment unsettles people. They cannot read you easily. They cannot predict your reactions. They cannot trigger you on schedule. They lose control. And control, once lost, is rarely regained. Here is the brutal truth most won't admit. People respect what they cannot move easily. If you are emotionally light, you are easy to push. If you are emotionally heavy, others adjust around you. Weight is not volume. It is density. You build it by caring less about noise and more about position. Position is not about titles or followers. It is about how others orient themselves around you. Do they wait for your response? Do they soften their tone? Do they think twice before crossing a line? These are not accidents. They are consequences. Now think about the last time you overreacted. Not explosively, subtly. You explained too much. You justified a choice that didn't need justification. You tried to manage someone else's interpretation of you instead of letting it be their burden. That moment cost you something. Maybe not immediately, but it trained others to expect access to your internal process. It taught them that pressure yields information. Detachment reverses this training. You become less available emotionally, and paradoxically, more influential. Be careful. This is not about becoming cold or distant for its own sake. That is imitation, not mastery. Forced aloofness cracks under pressure. True detachment is calm, not performative. It comes from knowing you don't need to win every exchange to win the arc. The arc is longer than the moment. Now watch what happens when you stop caring about being right in public. You let others make small mistakes without correction. You allow minor inaccuracies to pass when they don't affect the outcome. You reserve your energy for leverage points, not ego points. When you do speak, it lands. Because it's rare. Because it's timed. Because it's not defensive. That is when people listen. Most people speak to relieve themselves. Detached people speak to move the board. That is the difference. Think about it. The most powerful response is often the one you don't give immediately. The most commanding presence is often the one that doesn't scramble to be understood. Now watch what happens when someone tries to provoke you again, expecting the old pattern. You don't give it to them. You look at them, you pause, you let the moment breathe. And in that space, something breaks. Not you, their certainty. They start wondering what you know that they don't. They question whether they miscalculated. They feel exposed, even if they can't articulate why. That discomfort is not cruelty. It is consequence. Detachment doesn't attack. It allows gravity to do its work. Most people never notice this because they are too busy managing impressions to observe reactions. They are inside the storm, not watching it. When you step back emotionally, you gain perspective. You see patterns. You see who needs validation, who needs conflict, who feeds on reaction. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Now here is where most fail. They think detachment means disengagement from life, from ambition, from connection. Detachment is engagement without dependency. You still care about outcomes. You just don't let others dictate your internal state on the way there. You stop outsourcing your stability. Listen carefully. The moment you stop caring about being perceived as good, reasonable, agreeable, you become harder to manipulate. Guilt loses its grip. Shame slides off. Social pressure weakens. Not because you became immoral, because you became self-contained. Self-contained people are dangerous in subtle ways. They don't need applause to continue. They don't need permission to decide. They don't need consensus to move. They are not reckless. They are anchored. And anchors don't chase waves. Now think about the last argument you replayed in your head long after it ended. The words you wished you had said. The tone you wish you had used. That replay is caring turned inward. It's still attachment, just delayed. Detachment ends the replay. You observe the exchange, extract the lesson, and move on. No rumination, no self-flagellation. No fantasy corrections. You don't need to rewrite the past to control the future. You adjust positioning, not memory. Now watch what happens as you practice this. Your responses get shorter, your presence gets quieter, your boundaries get firmer without announcement. Some people drift away. They needed the old version of you, the reactive one, the available one, the one who filled silence for them. Let them go. Others move closer, cautiously, respectfully. They sense stability. They sense depth. You didn't recruit them. Your detachment did. Here's the part few are ready for. Detachment will make you misunderstood at first. People will project coldness, arrogance, indifference. They will test you to see if you still bleed. Be careful. If you rush to correct the narrative, you break the spell. Let the misunderstanding exist long enough to reveal who benefits from it. Silence is not absence. It is pressure, and pressure exposes structure. Now watch what happens when you stop caring about proving your value. You stop listing credentials. You stop explaining your intentions. You stop chasing acknowledgement. Your value becomes something others infer, not something you declare. Inference is more powerful than assertion, because it feels discovered. And what people discover themselves, they defend. Think about it. The strongest reputations are not loudly managed. They are quietly reinforced by consistency and restraint. You don't need to announce detachment. You embody it. And as you do, you'll notice a shift inside you. Less urgency, less noise, less internal bargaining. You respond, not react. You choose, not appease. You move when it matters. And when it doesn't, you let the moment pass without grabbing it. That is the switch. Once flipped, you cannot unfeel the difference. The world slows down just enough for you to see openings others miss. And right as you begin to understand how much power lives in not needing to be seen trying, you realize there is another layer, one most people never reach. Because detachment is not the end of caring. It is the refinement of it. And the moment you stop wasting emotional energy on noise, you start noticing how much of your life was being shaped by people who knew exactly how to pull you, and how differently the board looks when you no longer respond on cue. When you no longer rush to fill silence, when you allow tension to exist long enough to force truth to the surface. And that is when the real game begins. Because the next step is not about withdrawing further. It is about learning when to re-engage with precision, when to apply just enough presence to shift outcomes without ever surrendering your center. And if you're paying attention now, you can already feel where this is going. Because the question is no longer whether you can detach, but whether you can do it selectively, strategically, without becoming brittle. Because brittle detachment shatters under pressure, and true detachment bends, waits, and then moves exactly when it chooses to. And that choice, that moment of deliberate re-entry, is where most people lose control again, because they mistake restraint for retreat, and they don't yet understand how to step back in without giving themselves away, without reattaching to validation, without reopening the channels they just closed. And that is why the next thing you must understand is how to care just enough to win without ever returning to the old pattern of needing to be seen, needing to be approved, needing to be understood. Because once you see how that need was costing you, you won't want it back, but you will need to know how to operate without it, how to move among people who are still driven by it, how to use their urgency against them without exploiting or attacking, how to let their reactions do the work while you remain steady. Because if you rush this part, if you confuse detachment with disappearance, you'll lose momentum. And momentum, once lost, is harder to rebuild than reputation. So you must learn how to stay present without being hooked, visible without being exposed, engaged without being pulled. And that requires a different kind of discipline. One that doesn't announce itself, one that feels almost invisible from the outside. But inside it feels like standing on solid ground while everyone else is slipping. And as you begin to practice this, you'll notice something subtle but unmistakable starting to happen around you. In conversations, in conflicts, in rooms where decisions are made, people will start pausing before they speak to you. They will start choosing their words more carefully. They will start watching your reactions instead of assuming them. And that pause, that hesitation, is not respect yet, but it is the doorway to it. And whether you step through that doorway or sabotage it by caring too much at the wrong moment is what will determine whether detachment becomes your edge or just another phase you flirted with before returning to the comfort of reaction. Because the comfort is seductive and the pull back to old habits is strong, especially when pressure increases, especially when stakes rise, especially when someone challenges you in a way that touches identity, reputation, or belonging. And it is precisely in those moments that the detachment switch is tested. Because anyone can be calm when nothing is at risk. But the real measure is whether you can remain unmoved when the provocation is personal, when the criticism is public, when the silence feels dangerous. And that is where most people break. Not because they are weak, but because they have never learned how to let discomfort sit without immediately trying to resolve it. And until you learn that, until you can hold tension without flinching, you will always be reacting to the game instead of shaping it. Because shaping requires space, and space only exists when you stop caring about immediate relief and start caring about long-term position. And that shift, once made, changes not just how others treat you, but how you experience yourself. Because you stop feeling like you are constantly on trial, constantly defending, constantly adjusting, and you begin to feel something quieter, heavier, more stable, a sense that you can wait, that you can observe, that you can choose. And it is from that place that the next layer of detachment reveals itself. A layer that has nothing to do with appearing calm and everything to do with deciding where your attention goes. Because attention, not emotion, is the true currency of power. And once you understand how to withdraw it without disappearing, how to focus it without attachment, how to apply it without giving yourself away, you will realize that caring was never the problem. It was caring indiscriminately, caring reactively, caring where it gave others leverage. And as you start to separate what deserves your attention from what merely demands it, you will feel the pull to explain yourself one last time, to justify the shift, to soften the edge. And that is the moment you must resist, because explanation is the final hook, the last attempt of the old pattern to pull you back in. And if you can sit through that urge, if you can let it pass without acting on it, then you are ready to understand how detachment actually becomes a weapon without ever looking like one. How it allows you to win without appearing to fight. How it lets others exhaust themselves while you remain centered. Because the real advantage of detachment is not that you stop caring, it's that you start choosing exactly when and how you do. And everything changes once that choice becomes yours rather than a reflex. And to get there, you need to see one more thing clearly, something most people avoid looking at, because it reveals just how much of their behavior has been driven by fear rather than intention. And that realization is uncomfortable, but it is also the key. Because until you confront the specific fear that keeps pulling you back into reaction, the fear that whispers you'll lose something if you don't respond, you'll never fully flip the switch. And that fear is not what you think it is. It's not fear of conflict or rejection. It's fear of losing relevance, of becoming invisible, of not mattering in the moment. And once you see how that fear has been steering you, you can finally decide whether you want to keep paying its price, or whether you're ready to step into a different way of moving through the world. One where your value is not negotiated in real time. One where your presence is felt even in silence. One where you don't need to prove, explain, or perform to hold your ground, because the ground is already yours. And when you reach that point, the question is no longer how to stop caring, but how to wield care so precisely that it never betrays you again. And that is where the real discipline begins. Because from that point forward, every reaction becomes a choice. Every silence becomes intentional. Every engagement becomes strategic. And once you see how that works in practice, once you feel the shift in your body, in your timing, in the way people respond to you, you will understand why so few ever master this. Because it requires you to give up the comfort of immediate validation for the power of delayed impact. And that trade is one most people are never willing to make. Even when they sense, deep down, that it's the only one that actually pays. Delayed impact feels abstract until you live inside it. Then it becomes addictive. Because once you stop feeding the need to matter immediately, you start noticing how desperate everyone else is to do exactly that. You see the microtells, the rushed tone, the unnecessary clarification, the emotional leakage disguised as confidence. You see yourself in them. And that recognition is uncomfortable, because it means the old version of you was never losing because of lack of skill. You were losing because you were visible in the wrong ways, at the wrong times, to the wrong people. Listen carefully. Relevance is not created by constant presence. It is created by controlled absence. When you are always available, your presence depreciates. When you withdraw strategically, your presence compounds. People notice the gap. They feel it. They wonder what shifted. Not X, it's I. Not neglect, scarcity. Scarcity is not about manipulation. It's about respect for your own attention. Think about it. Your attention has been handed out like loose change. Anyone could trigger it. Anyone could pull it. A command, a look, a tone, a pause. And every time you reacted, you confirmed that access was cheap. Detachment raises the price. And once the price goes up, fewer people can afford to reach you casually. This is where most people misunderstand detachment and sabotage themselves. They think detachment means withdrawal from engagement entirely. They go quiet everywhere. They vanish. They mistake invisibility for leverage. Be careful. That is not detachment. That is avoidance. True detachment is selective engagement. You are present where it matters, absent where it doesn't, calm everywhere. You don't disappear from the room. You stop dancing for it. Now watch what happens when you do this in a professional setting. You stop responding instantly to every message. Not ignoring, just not prioritizing urgency that isn't yours. You reply when it fits your rhythm, not theirs. People adjust. At first, some get irritated. They were used to instant access. They interpret the delay as disrespect. What they're feeling is loss of control. And that feeling tells you everything you need to know about the dynamic you were in. Those who matter adapt. Those who don't reveal themselves. Most people never notice this because they rush to repair discomfort instead of observing it. Detachment allows discomfort to become information. Now think about conflict. When someone confronts you emotionally, their goal is rarely resolution. It's regulation. They want you to absorb their tension, validate their state, help them feel grounded. You've done this for years without realizing it. You took on their urgency. You matched their intensity. You made their emotions your problem. Detachment breaks that exchange. You don't escalate. You don't soothe prematurely. You stay steady. And in that steadiness, their emotional wave has nowhere to land. They calm down, or they expose themselves. Either outcome serves you. You didn't dominate them. You refused to be dragged. That distinction matters. Here is the brutal truth. Most conflicts persist not because of disagreement, but because of emotional synchronization. Two people locked into each other's nervous systems, amplifying tension through reaction. Detachment unsyncs the systems. You don't mirror, you don't escalate, you don't collapse. You hold your line, and lines held calmly are harder to cross. Now watch what happens when you stop caring about being included in every conversation. You don't insert yourself unnecessarily. You don't compete for airtime. You don't rush to prove relevance. People start referencing you instead of talking over you. Because when you speak less, your words become markers. Markers shift direction. Most people fill silence because they are afraid of it. You learn to let silence work. Silence is not empty. It is pressure without force. Think about a negotiation. The first person to break silence often reveals need. The second reveals position. When you care too much, you speak too soon. Detachment lets you wait, and waiting makes others negotiate against themselves. Now apply this socially. Someone makes a passive-aggressive comment. The old you would respond with humor, explanation, or subtle defense. Anything to keep things smooth. Now you pause. You look at them. You let the comment sit exactly where it landed. Now watch what happens when the room feels the weight of it. They backtrack. They clarify. They expose intention. You didn't accuse. You didn't escalate. You let gravity do the work. That is power without theatrics. Most people never notice this because they're too busy trying to be liked. Here's the brutal part. Being liked is often the tax you pay for being easy to control. When people know you need approval, they ration it. They reward compliance. They withdraw it to shape behavior. Detachment removes that leverage. You no longer chase warmth. You don't withdraw when it's withheld. You remain unchanged. That steadiness forces others to recalibrate. Some will try harder to get your reaction. Others will pull back. Uncertain. A few will step up. Respecting the shift. You don't manage these outcomes. You allow them. Because management implies need. Detachment implies choice. Now consider reputation. When you care too much, you micromanage how you're perceived. You correct small inaccuracies. You clarify intent. You preempt criticism. In doing so, you amplify attention on things that didn't matter. Detachment lets minor narratives pass. Major narratives reveal themselves. You respond only when it affects trajectory, not ego. This confuses people at first. They expect defense. They get silence. They expect engagement. They get neutrality. And neutrality unsettles more than aggression because it offers no emotional feedback to work with. You felt it, didn't you? That moment when someone didn't react to you and you suddenly became aware of yourself, of your tone, of your intent. That awareness is destabilizing. And destabilized people make mistakes. Now think about leadership. Not formal leadership, actual influence. Influence is not about charisma. It's about emotional gravity. People orient toward those who don't need them. Not because they're cruel, because need feels heavy. Detachment lightens your internal load and increases your external pull. Paradoxical. Most people chase influence by speaking more, asserting more, reacting faster. You gain it by doing the opposite. Now watch what happens inside you as this settles. Your internal dialogue quiets. You stop rehearsing conversations that haven't happened yet. You stop replaying ones that already ended. Your energy stays with you. That is not numbness. That is containment. Contained energy is usable. Leaked energy is wasted. Now here is where discipline matters. Detachment is not automatic. Under pressure, old habits resurface, especially when identity is touched. Someone questions your competence, your values, your intentions. The urge to defend flares. Be careful. This is where most people relapse. They detach in low-stakes moments and react in high-stakes ones. That inconsistency resets the pattern. You must practice detachment precisely where it feels hardest. Not by suppressing emotion, by delaying action. You let the feeling rise. You observe it. You don't obey it. That pause is the training ground. The pause is where control is built. Now watch what happens when you master that pause. Criticism lands, but doesn't hook. Provocation appears, but doesn't steer. Silence stretches, but doesn't threaten. You remain. Others adjust. This is the hidden mechanism. People respond not to what you say, but to how available you are to being moved. If you are easy to move, they push. If you are steady, they reposition themselves. That repositioning is respect in motion. Now, think about intimacy. Detachment doesn't mean emotional distance. It means emotional sovereignty. You share without overgiving. You listen without absorbing. You care without clinging. This makes connections safer, not colder. Because the other person is not responsible for regulating you. That responsibility stays with you. And people relax around those who don't demand regulation. Now here is the dark warning. Detachment will expose uncomfortable truths about your relationships. Some connections were held together by your over-functioning, your explanations, your emotional labor. When you stop doing that work, those connections weaken. Let them. They were costing you more than you realized. Others will strengthen, because they were built on mutual respect, not dependency. You don't choose who stays. Your detachment does. Now consider the social circle. When you stop reacting to subtle disrespect, you don't confront it. You simply stop rewarding it with engagement. People either correct their behavior or drift. No speeches required. No ultimatums. Just consequence. Most people never notice this because they think boundaries must be announced. Announced boundaries invite negotiation. Lived boundaries end it. Now think about the urge to explain yourself. Explanation is often a confession of insecurity. Not always, but often. When you explain unprompted, you reveal that you are managing perception. Detachment lets you explain only when it serves strategy, not anxiety. Your words become intentional, sparse, weighted. People listen differently when they sense you are not speaking to be understood, but to be clear. That clarity carries authority. Now here is where detachment turns into advantage. Once people stop being able to predict your reactions, they stop testing you casually. They become more careful, more precise. They bring better arguments. They choose words more thoughtfully. Your presence elevates the interaction, not because you demand it, because unpredictability demands respect. Predictable reactions invite manipulation. Think about it. The moment someone knows exactly how you'll react, they can steer you. Detachment breaks the script. Now watch what happens when you apply this consistently. Meetings shorten, conflicts de-escalate, conversations feel cleaner. You are no longer wrestling the moment. You are shaping the field. This is not mystical. It's mechanical. Human behavior responds to patterns. You changed yours. Others adapt. Now here is the part most people resist. Detachment requires you to tolerate being misunderstood temporarily. You must let people think the wrong thing about you long enough to see who they become in response. That waiting is uncomfortable, but it is also revealing. Those who rush to judge without curiosity were never allies. Those who wait, ask, observe, those are the ones worth engaging. Detachment filters your environment. Now think about status. Status is not claimed, it is granted. And it is granted to those who don't appear to need it. The moment you stop performing for status, others begin assigning it to you. Not consciously, instinctively, because humans read emotional cues before logic. And detachment signals internal sufficiency. Internal sufficiency is magnetic. Now watch what happens when someone challenges you openly. You don't counterattack. You don't explain. You ask one calm question, or you say nothing. Either way, you don't defend. Defense assumes threat. Detachment assumes position. That assumption shifts the frame. The challenger now looks like the one reaching. That is the reversal. Now, be careful here. Silence must be grounded, not sulking. If silence is loaded with resentment, it leaks. True detachment is neutral. You're not withholding to punish. You're withholding because there is nothing to give in that moment. That neutrality is what unsettles. Now consider ambition. Detachment doesn't dull it. It sharpens it. You stop chasing short-term wins that cost long-term leverage. You stop trading position for approval. You choose moves that compound quietly. Others rush. You wait. Others react. You observe. Others burn energy. You conserve it. This asymmetry grows over time. Slowly. Then suddenly. Now think about the last time you felt compelled to prove yourself. That compulsion is the residue of attachment. Detachment dissolves it. You don't need to prove. You demonstrate through consistency. You don't argue about who you are. You let time do that work. Time is the ultimate ally of the detached, because detachment aligns you with it. Reactive people fight time. They rush, they force, they overextend. Detached people let time reveal. Now watch what happens as this deepens. You become harder to read, but easier to trust. Because your reactions are stable. You don't swing. You don't spike. You don't vanish. You remain. That consistency builds a different kind of reputation. Not flashy, reliable. And reliability at the right moments is power. Now here is the final shift in this layer. You stop caring about being remembered for what you said. You care about being remembered for how you moved. Your pacing, your timing, your restraint. People forget words. They remember energy. They remember how you made moments feel. Detachment gives those moments weight. And as you stand there, no longer pulled by every stimulus, no longer compelled to fill every silence, no longer negotiating your worth in real time, you begin to see the deeper structure beneath social interaction. The way urgency is used to rush decisions. The way emotion is used to bend outcomes. The way noise is used to mask weakness. And once you see that structure, you realize that detachment is not the absence of care, but the architecture that allows care to be applied where it actually matters. Because without detachment, care leaks everywhere and changes nothing. But with detachment, care becomes directional, intentional, almost surgical. And this is where most people get uneasy, because they sense that something in them is shifting, that the old reflexes are losing their grip. And with that loss comes a strange, quiet, a space where choice exists. And choice is dangerous, because it removes excuses. It removes the story that you had no control, that you were forced to react, that you had to respond. Because now you know you didn't. And that knowledge changes how you see every interaction going forward. Because every provocation becomes optional. Every invitation to react becomes a decision point. And once you realize how many of those invitations you've been accepting automatically, you start to understand how much of your life has been shaped by other people's urgency rather than your own intent. And that realization is not comforting, but it is liberating, because it means you can stop, you can pause, you can choose differently. And that choice, repeated over time, builds a kind of authority that cannot be faked, because it is rooted not in performance, but in discipline. And discipline, once internalized, does not announce itself. It simply changes outcomes. And as those outcomes change, you'll notice that people start treating you differently without being able to explain why. They'll say you seem calmer, more grounded, harder to read, and they'll mean it as observation, not accusation. And that is when you know the detachment switch is no longer something you're trying to flip. It's something that has become part of how you move. And from that place, the final layer becomes visible. The layer where detachment is no longer just about restraint, but about precision, about knowing exactly when to step forward, when to apply pressure, when to speak, when to remain silent. Because silence alone is not the end game. Timing is. And timing requires something deeper than control. It requires clarity. Clarity about what actually matters to you. Because without that clarity, detachment becomes empty, directionless, and eventually brittle. And the moment you re-engage without clarity, you risk falling back into old patterns. Because engagement without clarity reopens attachment. And attachment, once reopened, will try to reclaim control. So the next thing you must understand is how to define what deserves your care. How to draw that line so cleanly that when you do engage, it does not pull you off center. Because true mastery is not detachment for its own sake. It is the ability to re-enter without losing yourself. And that is the part almost no one gets right. Because it requires you to be just as disciplined in caring as you were in pulling back. And that discipline is quieter, more demanding, and less forgiving than anything you've practiced before. Because now, the risk is not that you'll react too much. It's that you'll choose to care at the wrong moment. And that single misstep can undo months of restraint if you're not aware of it. Which is why the final phase of detachment is not about silence or distance at all. It's about alignment. Alignment between your attention, your values, and your timing. Because when those three are aligned, you can step into any room, any conflict, any relationship, and move deliberately without being hooked, without being rushed, without being bent. And that alignment is what separates those who merely look calm from those who actually are. And if you're still listening, if you've stayed with this without looking for reassurance or release, then you're ready to see how that alignment works in practice, how it protects you under pressure, how it allows you to care deeply without losing leverage, and how it ultimately determines whether detachment becomes a temporary tactic or a permanent advantage. Because at the highest level, detachment is not about withdrawal at all. It is about command of self first, and then, quietly, of the situation. And once you understand that, you'll realize that the real danger was never caring too little. It was caring without command. And that mistake, once seen clearly, is one you will never want to repeat. Command is not confidence. Confidence is often loud. Command is quiet because it doesn't need to prove itself. Listen carefully. The moment you start choosing where your care goes, you will feel a new kind of temptation, not the old urge to react, but the urge to overcorrect, to become so detached that nothing touches you, to make distance your identity. Be careful. That is just another addiction. You traded approval addiction for control addiction, and control addiction makes you brittle. Brittle people break the moment something unexpected happens. A loss, a betrayal, a public slight, a private disappointment. They shatter not because they cared, but because they believed detachment meant nothing could reach them. Things will reach you. The difference is what you do after they do. Detachment is not armor. It is posture. Armor is rigid. Posture is stable. Posture allows impact without collapse. So the final layer is this. You stop trying to feel nothing, and you start practicing, not acting from what you feel. That is the distinction that separates a controlled person from a numb one. Numbness is avoidance. Control is presence. Presence is what makes detachment powerful, because you can stand inside tension without needing to resolve it immediately. Think about it. If someone insults you and you feel nothing, you might be disconnected. If someone insults you and you feel it, but you don't move from it, that's command. You felt it, didn't you? Those moments when you stayed calm but inside you were lit up, your heart sped, your mind sharpened. That's not weakness. That's life. The test is whether you let that internal heat push your hands. Now watch what happens when you stop trying to win every exchange and start trying to win positioning. Positioning is where future wins come from. It's the difference between a punch and a grip. A punch is momentary. A grip changes what comes next. Detachment is the grip. You do not need to prove dominance. You need to be unmovable where it counts. And to be unmovable, you need one thing most people never develop: a personal policy. Not rules you recite. A policy you live. When do you respond? When do you stay silent? What do you never explain? What do you always address? What do you walk away from immediately? If you don't decide these things before pressure hits, pressure will decide for you. Pressure always chooses reaction. That is the trap. Most people think detachment is a mood, a vibe, a tone. It isn't. It's a system. A system protects you when you're tired. A system protects you when you're triggered. A system protects you when you're tempted to return to old patterns. Here is the brutal truth. You don't rise to the occasion. You fall to your default. Detachment changes the default. So you need to install it. Not through slogans. Through repeated, boring choices. Now I'm going to show you what that looks like without dressing it up. Someone sends a message designed to pull you into urgency. A. We need to talk. Attend. A vague accusation. A public tag. An implication. Old you would sprint toward resolution to stop the discomfort. New you reads it and waits. Not to punish. To see what happens next. Because people who throw smoke often rely on you to provide the fire. If you don't, their smoke dissipates. If there is real substance, it will return with clarity. Real issues can survive time. Manipulation cannot. Most people never notice this. They treat every signal as equal. Detachment ranks signals. Now think about workplace politics. Someone questions your decision in front of others. Old you defends the decision. New you asks one calm question that forces them to own their intention. What outcome are you trying to improve? And then you stop talking. Now watch what happens when they have to answer. Their motive shows. If it's genuine, they become constructive. If it's performative, they stumble. You didn't attack them. You made them speak. Detachment is not silence for silence's sake. It is controlled speech. It is speaking only to move the board. Now consider the social circle again. There's always someone who tests boundaries with jokes. Little cuts disguised as humor. They want you to laugh so they can claim innocence. Old you laughs, or you confront emotionally. Either way, you give them a scene. New you gives them nothing. No laugh. No anger. Just a look that says, without words, I saw that. Out. And then you continue the conversation as if they didn't matter. That is not cruelty. That is calibration. You are teaching the room what gets access to you, and you are teaching the person what doesn't. Now watch what happens over time. They stop, or they escalate. If they stop, you gained respect. If they escalate, you gained information. Either way, you win, because you didn't lose yourself. Now think about relationships, where detachment is often misunderstood and abused. Detachment is not neglect. Neglect is weaponized absence. Detachment is stable presence without clinging. You communicate clearly, but you don't chase reassurance. You offer warmth, but you don't beg for it back. You are consistent, but you don't audition. This changes everything. Because when you stop auditioning, you stop making your worth negotiable. And when your worth is not negotiable, the other person either respects it or reveals they never intended to. That revelation hurts. Be careful. This is where many people panic. They feel the relationship shifting and they rush to restore the old pattern. They over-explain. They overgive. They over-apologize. They reattach. And they call it love. It's fear. Love without self-command turns into dependence. Dependence turns into resentment. Resentment turns into sabotage. Detachment prevents that chain. Now think about public criticism. Someone posts something about you, a narrative, AD. Old you responds instantly to defend yourself. New you doesn't respond publicly at all. Not because you're weak, because public response is often the oxygen the critic wants. They want visibility through your reaction. They want your status to raise their conflict. Detachment denies them that. You handle what matters privately, strategically, or not at all. And when you do speak, you speak from position, not from injury. Most people never notice this because they confuse silence with losing. Silence is only losing when you are afraid of it. If you can tolerate silence, silence becomes a weapon. Now here is the dark warning. Detachment makes you a mirror. And many people hate mirrors. They will accuse you of being cold, arrogant, distant, manipulative. Not because you became those things. Because your steadiness exposes their volatility. Your restraint exposes their impulsiveness. Your calm exposes their neediness. And people often attack what exposes them. So you must be prepared. Not emotionally. Strategically. You don't argue with labels. You don't defend your tone. You don't apologize for not reacting. You remain consistent. Because consistency is what makes accusations look like projections. Think about it. If you suddenly go detached in a way that feels performative, people will sense it. They will push harder. You will crack. But if you become steadily, quietly self-contained over time, their accusations lose traction. The room starts trusting the pattern. Pattern beats narrative. Now let's talk about the moment you will be tempted to throw all this away. It will happen when you are genuinely wronged. Not slighted. Wronged. Someone takes credit for your work. Someone lies about you. Someone crosses a line. Your body will surge. You will want to correct the injustice immediately. You will want the world to know. You will want the scale balanced now. Listen carefully. This is where detachment becomes mastery, or it becomes theater. Here is the brutal truth. Immediate retaliation often feels satisfying and costs you position. Delayed response feels unsatisfying and builds leverage. Leverage is the only thing that makes justice possible in social systems. Without leverage, you're just venting. So what do? You document quietly. You speak to the right person. Not everyone. You choose timing. You choose arena. You choose words. You don't bleed emotion into the process. Emotion is information for you, not fuel for your actions. That is the detachment switch under real pressure. Now watch what happens when you operate like this. People who expected an emotional outburst don't get it. They relax. They expose more. They get sloppy. And then you move. Not loudly. Cleanly. Precisely. That is winning without noise. Most people never notice this because they confuse moral outrage with effective action. Outrage is loud. Effective action is quiet. Now think about boundaries again. The strongest boundary is not no, it's tombs. The strongest boundary is non-participation. You don't attend the drama. You don't explain why you aren't attending. You don't argue about whether the drama is fair. You simply don't show up. And over time, people stop inviting you to the circus. Not because they fear you, because they can't use you. That is peace with power. Now, consider what detachment does internally. It gives you back your attention. And attention is where your life actually is. Most people are not living their own lives. They are living inside other people's expectations, reactions, and opinions. They wake up and check what others think. They work and wonder how they're seen. They speak and monitor faces. They exist under surveillance, even when no one is watching. Detachment ends the surveillance. You stop making your nervous system a public utility. Now, here is the final paradox. The more detached you become, the more sensitive your perception gets. Not emotionally sensitive, strategically sensitive. You notice shifts faster. You sense agendas. You catch contradictions. Because you're not flooded by the need to respond. You're free to observe. Observation is the real advantage. And that is why Machiavelli valued it, not as theory, but as survival in a world where people rarely say what they mean. But remember, detachment is not cynicism. Cynicism is lazy. Detachment is disciplined. Cynicism assumes everyone is bad. Detachment assumes everyone is human, including you. And human behavior follows patterns. You study patterns. You don't moralize them. You don't hate people for them. You simply stop being trapped by them. Now watch what happens when you integrate this fully. You will still care, but you will care on purpose. You will care about your work, not about applause. You will care about your character, not about reputation management. You will care about your relationships, not about being needed. You will care about outcomes, not about moments. And because of that, you will stop giving away your power to whoever is loudest, moodiest, or most urgent in the room. You will become the one people can't move easily. And that changes how they treat you. Now I'll give you the cold closure you need to hold this in your bones. The world is full of people who will press every exposed nerve they can find, not because they are evil, but because pressure reveals leverage, and leverage creates advantage. And you have been walking around with your nerves exposed, calling it openness, calling it honesty, calling it being real, while quietly paying the price in lost position, lost respect, lost peace. Detachment is you finally deciding you are not paying that price anymore. You stop reacting to be understood. You stop explaining to be safe. You stop performing to be liked. You start choosing. You start waiting. You start observing. You start moving only when the move counts. And when you do this long enough, something strange happens. You don't just win more. You suffer less. Because the suffering was never caused by what happened. It was caused by how quickly you made what happened mean something about you. You made every glance a verdict, every silence a rejection, every critique a collapse. And then you acted from that collapse. Now you don't. Now you let things be what they are before you decide what they mean. That is the detachment switch. And once it's flipped, the old you becomes unrecognizable, not because you became colder, but because you became harder to steer, harder to hook, harder to use. And in a world where most people are reactive, that is what looks like power. That is what feels like calm. And that is what, quietly, relentlessly, makes you win.